Hi, my name's Don Elliott, and I'm an American car dealer. I'm pretty passionate about the automobile business. In fact, my mother swears that my very first word was caw, 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 as one went down the street in front of our house. I've been in this business almost 45 years. 10 of those years, I was with the factory, General Motors, Chevrolet Motor Division, and I was in marketing and advertising. And then on a youthful dream, my wife and we came from families with no money. We didn't have much money, but we had a dream. I resigned from General Motors and moved to Texas. In fact, we moved in with my sister and brother-in-law for about 3 or 4 months while I went out and started knocking on dealers' doors, seeing if they were willing to sell, knowing all the time that even if they were willing to sell, I might not have enough money to buy them. Luckily, we found a small dealership not too far out of Houston. We put together every single thing that we had, and down to legitimately the very last red cent was enough to buy that dealership. Since that time, 36 years ago, we've been able to add to our dealerships, so we have them in North Carolina and Texas, and at one point in time, I had as many as 13 different franchises. All of them were domestic franchises except one, which was an import. I don't have the import store anymore, and I'm kind of glad I don't. You'll find out in a little while why I feel that way. And during today, I might use interchangeably the word bailout and bankruptcy. So if you hear one or the other, I'm really referring to the same thing that occurred in early spring of 2009 that we all know so much about. Since 2008 and early 2009, when the bankruptcies occurred and the Great Modern Depression occurred in America, I've heard a lot of people say, gee, I'll never buy another General Motors car. I'll never buy another Chrysler car because they took bankruptcy. I understand those sentiments, but as you'll find out in a few minutes, maybe the bankruptcies were the very best thing for our country, for our economy, for our people. My goal here today is not to bash anybody or any entity, but there are some economic realities that pertain to things like foreign competition and labor unions that need to be discussed, that need to be digested, and in the context of history, need to be really reevaluated. So how did the automobile industry actually begin? Well, it really began back in the very early 1900s. At one time, there were more than 1,800 auto manufacturers in the United States. Some of them you may remember: Packard, Kaiser Frazer, Hudson, that had the Hudson Hornet, and Studebaker. They're all gone now. We're down to the main big three, two of which went bankrupt, and for a good reason. By 1920, automobiles had become a very mainstream consumer product in America. It's hard to imagine now, but in the early 1900s, cars were sold by catalog and by door-to-door salesmen. They came shipped to the dealer in crates where he'd have to put some of it together after it got off of the boxcar. Quickly, manufacturers realized that they needed to get their products into all the communities in America. Remember, back then, American roads were very poor. People weren't mobile in America. If you lived in a community like the community I grew up in, you really didn't go outside of your community for very much of anything. So there had to be an automobile dealer, and the dealer, you bought the parts from the dealer. There were no Napas or AutoZones or anything back then. If you had a Chevrolet, you bought parts at the Chevrolet dealership. If you needed your Chevrolet serviced, you went to the Chevrolet dealership to get it serviced. It was a very compartmentalized society back in the early 1900s and even up through World War II. During that time, the manufacturers started franchising their dealers, realizing that they needed the dealers in these communities. So knowing that there weren't very many roads and people didn't go between communities much at all. As a matter of fact, I grew up in a community outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I kid a friend of mine who's a dealer in a community 4.5 miles as a crow flies away, that when I grew up, I never went to his community because it was too far away. You had to go up and over hills on bad roads, and there was no real reason to go that direction. So we just stayed in our community. We dated girls in our community. We went to dances in our community, went to the grocery store in our community, and we went to the Ford dealership in our community, the Chrysler dealership in our community, and the Chevrolet dealership in our community. And also remember, back then, there were no foreign cars being sold in America. It was only domestic brands. So franchising began in the United States in these days of bad roads, poor mobility, and franchises were put in every little community. And we had a lot more franchises than we even have today. Even for the domestic manufacturers, we not only had Chevrolet, Buick, GMC, and Cadillac, but we also had Oldsmobile and Pontiac. Chrysler not only had Chrysler, Jeep, and Dodge, but they also had Plymouth, and at one point in time, a brand called Eagle. So a lot of franchises have gone away, but it was nobody's fault that the demand existed for this new thing called an automobile in the early 1900s. People wanted them. They were getting away from horses and buggies and going to the car. And the market demanded it. The manufacturers that survived, basically the big three, gave them what they wanted. There was another thing that came into being in the early 1900s, and that's labor unions. And they came into being for a good reason. Safe working conditions in not only automobile plants, but steel plants and other manufacturing environments were not as good as they should have been, and certainly nowhere near what they are today. So your labor unions had a very important place in American society for many, many, many decades. And of course, they still exist in the big three domestic manufacturers' plants today. But over time, the unions, because there were only the big three in America and there was no foreign competition, demanded more and more and more, not only in wages, not only in pensions, not only in health care, but in what we call work rules, where maybe you were only allowed to pick up a broom. And if somebody else that wasn't a person that was allowed to pick up a broom picked up a broom, it was a bad thing. And the work rules became more restrictive and more restrictive. So we had all of these things going on at the same time. Well, if a labor union, UAW in our case, threatened to strike or did strike, they got generally more wages and more benefits to go along. Well, that wasn't too hard for the manufacturers to contend with because only the domestic manufacturers were here. All of them were unionized. So if the benefits got better for one, they got better for all, and they could pass those increased costs along to the consumer. So as long as America was compartmentalized, as long as we were the only ones making cars in our country, we could contend with the unions getting more and more and more and more. But as I'll point out a little bit later, in today's environment, it was a thing that we just couldn't go any further with. It made us totally non-competitive in the marketplace, or certainly it was a big factor in what made us non-competitive in the marketplace and led to bankruptcy. Another interesting thing happened back between 1925 and 1936, where the Japanese learned from our teaching them how to build a car. And consequently, when they passed the law in 1936 and effectively kicked us out, some companies came into being called Toyota and Datsun, Nissan today. And they were helped to come into existence by their own government. So it was a combination of a government and private partnership that put the Japanese into the car business after we taught them how to do it. Now we get to World War II and what happened? Well, we know that we fought in Europe against the Germans, and we know that we fought Japan because of Pearl Harbor and some other political factors. What happened during World War II in America? Well, we shut down. They shut the American car plants down, voluntarily, by the way. All General Motors and Ford and Chrysler were all in. They said, we're going to help the war effort. You know, the American public, our fathers and grandfathers, and great-grandfathers in some cases, were having to ration gas and ration food and have victory gardens where they grew their own vegetables so that they wouldn't strain the supply to our soldiers. So we shut down in America and we started building tanks and airplanes and the other weapons of war, and there were no cars being built. All those franchise dealers, those independent businessmen out in the communities in America, they didn't have any cars to sell. They sucked it up. They made do. They scrapped parts. They did whatever they had to do during that time because they knew we were at war and they were part of the team. After World War II, something even more dramatic happened, something that we should take a real history lesson from, and we should be proud of too. Most people have heard of the Marshall Plan in Europe, the plan to rebuild all those areas that were so bombed out and devastated, the industrial areas of Germany and Belgium and France and Italy and other countries, England. That plan in today's dollars cost the American taxpayer $160 billion. Germany alone was almost $20 billion. And then what happened in Japan, and this is what most people haven't heard of unless you're a real history buff. It was called the Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers Act. It essentially gave General MacArthur a dictatorial power to spend money just like the Marshall Plan did in Europe to rebuild Japan. American taxpayer dollars. Those taxpayer dollars in Japan also were in the billions. As a matter of fact, $24.1 billion. Now, to put that into perspective, the bankruptcies of our two companies, Chrysler and General Motors, combined were $12.6 billion. Now, $12.6 billion to save our own American companies that needed to be saved for good reason. More reasons I'll show you I'll reveal in just a moment. But we spent more money in Germany in the Marshall Plan. We spent more money by good measure in Japan of American taxpayer dollars than we did when the General Accounting Office finally netted out the cost of the Chrysler General Motors bankruptcy of 2009 of $12.6 billion. Think about that. A country that invaded us because of America's good heart. We went back in and rebuilt them, rebuilt their industrial complex. Why should we ever say that I'll never buy another Chrysler or General Motors product because they took bankruptcy? So not only did we put billions and billions and billions of dollars to rebuild Germany and Japan, but we immediately, after World War II, invited them to come to our country to compete. Pretty well unrestricted. No tariffs like they put on us in 1936 in Japan. We said, we rebuilt your industrial complex, start building stuff and sending it to America. But let me step back from the war and the billions that we spent rebuilding the people that we were at war with American taxpayer dollars. But let me talk about right after the war what happened. President Eisenhower is given credit for the National Highway Act. And basically that's the money that was put into all of our designing and building all of our interstate highways. And America became much more mobile after World War II. Better roads, better cars, better transportation of all sorts. So people were not locked into that compartmentalized community like they were for all those decades leading up to the war. They were moving around. And because of that, had the domestic manufacturers started with a clean sheet of paper in franchising their dealer organizations after World War II, certainly in the 50s and 60s, they wouldn't have put nearly as many dealers in. There would have been no need. There wouldn't have been a need to have a dealer 4 miles away from another dealer in small communities. They would have done exactly the same thing that the Japanese are given credit for being so clairvoyant about in 1960s. They weren't clairvoyant. They benefited by the circumstances of the time, just as they benefited by our invitation to come in and compete with us at a time when they were franchising dealers in the 60s, and the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and even into the early 2000s. Our dollar was very strong. Now, most of my friends would, if I asked them, I said, do you want to have a strong dollar or a weak dollar? And most of them would say a strong dollar, not realizing the implications of a strong dollar. The strong dollar, all those years when the Japanese manufacturers were franchising their organizations in America and starting to import in mass tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of vehicles into America, the dollar was very strong, which only meant that they could build that small fuel-efficient car in Japan with low cost of labor, with a weak yen versus a strong dollar. They could put it on a ship, bring it over to America, sell it, and make a very good profit margin on that vehicle. On the other side, and I was in Detroit in the early part of these days, we wanted to compete with those small fuel-efficient cars. You know, you've heard people say, well, those American manufacturers were really stupid, that they weren't building cars that people wanted, and people wanted fuel-efficient cars and these small cars. Well, they did want some of those cars, there's no question, and that number grew year by year for things like energy crises and escalating gas prices and so on. But we couldn't build those small cars given the circumstances that had been part of our history since the early 1900s, meaning we had a strong dollar, which means our cost to manufacture here, we couldn't do what they did. As a matter of fact, we could not make money on any small car we built, period. I was in charge of Vega and Chevette at periods of time as far as on the marketing end of the business. We knew that we were going to lose money on every single one of those vehicles. We wanted to build vehicles. We wanted to be in that market. Heck, we were in that market in South America and Europe and other places in the world. We knew how to build small cars. This wasn't any bunch of geniuses from Japan that said, boy, we know how to build small cars. Too bad those dumb Americans don't. We knew very well how to build them, but the circumstances that existed in America, the strong dollar, the labor union wages, the labor union benefits, pensions, and health care, just were prohibitive, and we couldn't wind that clock back. We couldn't start back at the beginning. We started in the 1920s. They never did have labor unions because they don't have labor unions in Japan. They didn't have health care costs because it's socialized medicine in Japan. We had all those things built into the cost of our cars, and because a low-cost car doesn't have much of a markup, there was just nowhere for the American manufacturer to go at a time when that segment of the market continued to grow and grow and grow and grow. And the Japanese took advantage of it. You wouldn't blame them, but it wasn't the Americans' fault. We taught them how to build cars in the beginning. We know how to build cars, and we know how to build quality cars. But we just couldn't do it given the circumstances of our legacy cost for every single car that we made in America. Up until now, I've been discussing what actually did happen. The $11.7 billion net loss to the American Treasury because of the Chrysler and General Motors bailout. A net loss that pales in comparison with the billions and billions more that we spent after World War II on our now allies but once former enemies, Japan and Germany, to rebuild their industrial infrastructure. But I do hear from friends and colleagues and acquaintances this statement: why didn't the American government just let Chrysler and General Motors go bankrupt the normal way, the way that takes time to go through the court system? Even Mr. Romney, during the 2008 presidential campaign, made the statement, "Let them go broke." He later recanted that statement and said he realized that that would have been an impossibility because of the impact that it would have had on our economy. And here's the impact. Secretary of Treasury Jacob Lew is on record as stating, had just General Motors gone bankrupt, it would have cost America 1.8 million jobs. Now you might say that General Motors doesn't have 1.8 million employees, and that's right. But their suppliers, their dealers, their dealer employees, and the whole string of people who are dependent on the American automobile industry would have been impacted, and it would have cost 1.8 million jobs and $40 billion, not the 11.7 that we ended up losing on the two bailouts. And then it even goes further, that had General Motors gone bankrupt, many economists say that the entire auto industry would have gone bankrupt in America. That would have cost American jobs to the tune of 4.15 million jobs and over $105 billion. Not the 11.7, but 105 billion. So it's agreed now in retrospect that the government did take the right tact in doing these extraordinary bankruptcy procedures to save an industry that arguably, along with steel, was one of the two industries that built America and it made America what it is today. So, why were these bankruptcies necessary and even good for America? Well, let's look back at what was going on. We had all these decades of built-up legacy costs that just couldn't be shed. There was no way to ever shed them under normal circumstances. The Great Recession of 2008 was actually fortuitous and fortunate in forcing some decisions to be made that could have never been made otherwise, and that was the bankruptcies of the two auto corporations. Stephen Ratner, the car czar, did some miraculous things in a short period of time. Yes, it hurt dealers, it hurt union members, it hurt bondholders, it hurt, everybody had to take a sacrificial piece of that pie in order for it to work. But they put it together and it did work. Today, General Motors and Ford and Chrysler are stronger than ever. Their products are better than ever. As a matter of fact, they're among the best in the world. Anybody that tells you any different just doesn't understand. They're talking about, like I did when I was a kid. If my dad had a Chevy and my neighbor's daddy had a Ford, we would just almost have a fist fight saying whose is the best, when we didn't really have all the facts. It's just that our dads had that car. Well, perhaps maybe your dads or mothers or brothers or sisters have had some of the cars and they'll swear by them. And they're not bad cars. The winner today is the American consumer. Every car out there, whether it's a Japanese car, a German car, or a big three domestic car, is a good car, a high quality car. But what I would ask you today is to consider the next time that you're thinking about purchasing a new vehicle, think about what the American car manufacturers have meant to this country over the decades since almost 1900. And think about the great quality the cars have and the great designs that are coming out. And give the American car manufacturers another chance. Thanks very much. Appreciate your time.